Hey guys, today I am reacting to the simple genius of the interstate highway system by Wendover Productions. Should be pretty interesting, and if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel, that would really help out. Now let's get into the video.
This video was made possible by CuriosityStream. Subscribe to their Nebula bundle deal at curiositystream.com/Wendover to watch an exclusive companion video to this. It's really just 4 lanes, a median, and some on and off ramps. The interstate highway system is no engineering marvel, no unprecedented undertaking, no massively innovative concept. It's a simple idea, one that arose since the earliest days of the automobile. It's not exciting, which is why it often goes so.
I mean, driving is not that exciting anyways. Imagine having to drive for hours along this. It's mind-numbing and just kind of boring. Yeah, driving can be just really just boring, to be honest. And kind of like it can be tiring as hell too. Like kind of hurts your back and such. So I'd rather take like public transportation. I wish public transportation in the US was better as well.
Underappreciated. Take the interstates away though, and you have a weaker nation. You have one.
True. Maybe we could build public transportation instead.
With dramatically starker regional divides, one with increased.
But some regional divides aren't even necessarily that bad. I mean, contributes to diversity, makes it more interesting, might increase tourism, even
decentralization. More specifically, you have a nation absent of a noticeable portion of the late 1900s economic development and transformation. These words, like the system itself, still aren't exciting, but put more simply, if you are an American, regardless of whether you use the interstate system, your life would be noticeably different in a reality without the interstates.
It might be better though if we had, again, good public transportation.
It's a single collection of roadways with an influence so great that it permeates into every American's life.
That is true though. It does have a massive effect on everybody in the US.
It all started here, 102 years ago. 79 vehicles departed from the White House's ellipse at 11:15 a.m. on July 7th, 1919. They snaked through the district streets before crossing into Maryland and stopping for lunch in Rockville at 12:30 p.m. The coupling on one of their kitchen trailers broke, and a car's fan bells too, but all in all, it was an uneventful 7-hour, 46-mile, 74-kilometer journey to the Frederick Fairgrounds. 12.5 hours later, they woke up, left, drove, arrived, and slept again. This cycle repeated itself. Day after day, they cut 40 or 50 or 60 miles deeper into their westward journey. The convoy climbed through the heights of the Appalachian Mountains, trekked through the mud of Ohio, before crossing the Mississippi River at 4:10 p.m. on July 22nd. From there, they entered an area defined by desolation. Few dared venture west in a motor vehicle in 1919, always opting for the relative comfort and speed of passenger trains.
Which makes sense, I mean, honestly. It's an efficient and useful system.
This convoy, though, was making the journey specifically to determine just how difficult this feat was, to what extent such a journey was feasible for military logistics purposes. The answer came quickly. Despite routing themselves on the most developed transcontinental road of the time, the Lincoln Highway, they constantly had to divert around disrepair, physically disassemble covered bridges to get their trucks through, and fight physics on roads too narrow for an oncoming car to pass. Gas stations were few and far between, so such travel required truly expedition-level planning. Each time they entered a city, though, they were greeted by hordes of intrigued locals and dignitaries, but those crowds thinned as the convoy crawled further into the desolate West. Most, but certainly not all, of their vehicles successfully traversed the Rockies, and the same can be said for their trip across some of the Lincoln Highway's roughest roads in Utah. With time, though, the trend reversed, roads improved, and they finally saw pavement again as the convoy entered California, its final state. After a final evening in Oakland, California, the vehicles loaded onto a ferry, crossed the bay, and made a ceremonious arrival in San Francisco, accompanied by a massive parade and a formal dinner. That was September 6th, 1919, 62 days after their departure from the White House ellipse. Having concentrated nearly all their waking hours
Damn, that is a long time.
on driving, the math works out to an average travel speed of just 5.65 miles or 9 kilometers per hour. A staggeringly slow pace on a road branded as a highway in a year featuring technologies such as electric refrigerators, airplanes, and long-distance phone service. The convoy accomplished its mission of appraising the feasibility of this route for more practical military purposes, but the report back to Washington was not positive. One lieutenant colonel, tasked with observing the journey, wrote, quote, "Extended trips by trucks through the middle western part of the United States are impractical until the roads are improved, and then only a light truck should be used on long hauls." It was clear that, for now, until roads were improved, transcontinental motor trips would remain the domain of publicity stunts and enthusiasts. But then the years started passing. Administration after administration, observing the growing presence of motor vehicles in the lives of increasingly everyday Americans, recognized that road construction was not something that could be left the responsibility of states. While individual
Well, why not though?
states did make plenty of progress building high-quality urban and rural roads, their interests were insular. Iowa, for example, would have no interest building a highway with the primary purpose of connecting Illinois to Nebraska. As Americans went off to fight in Europe during World War II, they observed the efficiency of Germany's national Reichsautobahn highway system, but when they returned home,
Yeah, I mean, Germany does have the Autobahn. It's very efficient. I mean, more efficient than the US highway system. But even then, they still have better public transportation than us nowadays, I mean. So we could have both, I mean, but we really should focus more on the public transportation than the highway. Doesn't mean we shouldn't give attention to the highway, though, of course, but still. Like, we could build a lot better for the amount of money the US has. They could really make things work. But they just don't care, it seems. And, you know, with all the money the oil companies and, like, car companies give, corruption is just, like, very apparent. I mean, back in the day, I think they even ripped up, trams and subways, because car companies bought out these tram companies, and they just ripped it up because they wanted more people to drive. And then, of course, with suburban sprawl and all that, it makes it just harder to walk and use public transportation because you have to drive everywhere.
they were forced to navigate a patchwork of state systems of varying quality to get anywhere beyond their local areas. In the 1950s, when America was a near decade out from landing men on the moon, it still took significant planning and the better part of 10 days to reasonably traverse from one coast to the other. While this might have been inconvenient for road-tripping Americans, it mostly meant that there were regions that simply could not compete with coastal areas in the industrial sector due to high transport costs and times. It was clear something had to change, but efforts to increase highway construction at the federal level were constantly stalled by funding issues and a general lack of volition. But then came someone new. One of the members of the 1919 Transcontinental Convoy, in fact, the very lieutenant colonel who provided the earlier report on the journey to Washington, continued on in his military career and rose through the ranks until he became Supreme Allied Commander of the European Theater in World War II. Then, upon return to the US, he entered a political career, culminating with his inauguration as president on January 20th, 1953. This was, of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Yeah, Eisenhower was not the best. I mean, the highway system. He focused on the highway system instead of doing other things that were more necessary, in my opinion. Like, he really should have developed, like an interstate train system and such. Would have been a lot better money spent, in my opinion.
With the groundwork laid by decades of planning and false starts, Eisenhower's task was centered on finally finding the political will and funding to turn this concept map, a 1955 publication by the Bureau of Public Roads, into reality. After nearly 3 years of political maneuvering, he succeeded. On June 29th, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 was signed, dedicating some $25 billion to constructing 41,000 miles or 66,000 kilometers of highway. Unlike previous attempts at similar programs, the federal government would now pay 90% of the costs of these interstate highways, with individual states responsible for the rest, largely funded by a hike in the federal gas tax. Just 3 months after the bill's signing, paving work began on a
And nowadays, this federal gas tax is not as useful because cars are so much more efficient than electric cars. So now they're thinking of changing it to a miles driven tax, pretty much.
section of Interstate 70 in Kansas, and 2 months after that, the same section opened to the public, representing the first miles of a system that would engulf the country over the coming decades. Now, whether it's I-40 in Tennessee or I-90 through Idaho, the way these roads were built was highly standardized. That was, after all, the point. These standards are codified in a simple 8-page document entitled A Policy on Design Standards Interstate System. To start with, fundamentally, interstates must have controlled access, meaning the manner in which vehicles enter or exit the roadway must be controlled through on- and off-ramps. That's why, unlike with many state highways, you never see intersections with stoplights on interstates except when rules are violated. The standards also set out a minimum speed: 50 miles or 80 kilometers per hour in urban and mountainous areas, 70 miles or 110 kilometers per hour in rural areas, and maximum grade, up to 7% corresponding to 370 feet of elevation gain per mile of road or 70 meters per kilometer depending on speed and topography. There must be at least 2 lanes in each direction of travel, 12 feet or 3.5 meters in width, with a cross slope, essentially an angle to allow for rain runoff, of at least 1.5 and ideally 2% grade. Tunnels and bridges must have at least 16 feet or 5 meters of vertical clearance, although less is allowed through urban areas as long as an alternate route with 16-foot clearance is available.
There really should not be highways in such true urban areas, though. It should go around. There should not be highways and wide streets through cities. It should always go around the city instead. Yeah.
Aside from a few smaller details, that's the entirety of the Interstate Highway Design Standards. It's incredibly simple. Implementing this nationwide, however, was no simple endeavor. When the project started in the 50s, 1 mile of interstate cost some $8.5 million to construct, or $5.3 million per kilometer. However, through the decades, as labor costs rose and the simplest sections stood completed, this ramped up to over $34 million per mile, or $21 million per kilometer. Unsurprisingly, the interstate system quickly blew past its original $25 billion budget allocation, but people and governments were convinced. The project gained more and more funding and was reaching completion by the time the 80s turned into the 90s. To complete the original vision, just one last section remained: a 12.5-mile, 20-kilometer stretch through Glenwood Canyon, Colorado. With 1,000-foot walls flanking on each side, little room exists aside the Colorado River for a roadway, but a complex collection of bridges and tunnels were constructed at a cost of $960 million, inflation adjusted, corresponding to $75 million per mile or $47 million per kilometer of roadway. Once this engineering marvel was completed in 1992,
It is an engineering marvel, yeah, that's
however, the nation was connected, and more than 2 decades after his death, Eisenhower's vision was realized. His 62-day transcontinental expedition from 1919 now takes a mere 42 hours. In such a decentralized country, consisting of a patchwork of states, each with unique governments, laws, cultures, and more, the consistency of a nationwide federal transportation system is, in and of itself, unique. It is one of the most regular interactions Americans, especially in far-flung western and southern regions, might have with a federal program. Today, the largest urban center located further than 25 miles or 40 kilometers from an interstate highway is Fresno, California, with a population of about 500,000. In fact, only 14 cities with over 100,000 people are located further than this distance. Even Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico are now included in this program, despite the fact that their interstates don't actually extend
true, which is kind of interesting.
interstate. With wide lanes, smooth turns, consistent grades, and more, these highways are remarkably safe. While nationwide, the US averages 1.3 deaths per 100 million vehicle miles traveled, Interstates, for the same 100 million vehicle miles, observe just 0.55 deaths each year. Incredibly, that means that, assuming the alternative is equivalent travel on non-interstate roads, this system is responsible for saving about 6,500 lives per year. Beyond the moral component, the innate human desire to preserve life,
Although I'd imagine public transportation would save a lot more lives.
the US Department of Transportation, on a statistical basis, values a human life at $11.7 million when evaluating potential safety standards, so the safety profile of the interstate highway system by itself has a theoretical economic impact of about $75 billion per year, therefore easily justifying its cost alone. But then there's the more direct impacts. Among the more populated states, construction disproportionately took place in southern states such as Georgia, South Carolina, or Arkansas on a basis of miles constructed per capita. Then, in less populous states, the interstate disproportionately penetrated the American West, with states such as Utah, Montana, Nevada, and Wyoming receiving the most miles per capita. Therefore, it was the South and West that received the greatest impact. In essence, what these roadways did was connect the US's economic centers to the periphery, so the periphery had the most to gain by, effectively, reducing the relative distance to centers by a factor of 30% on average. In the case of Interstate 5, for example, which runs along the entire west coast from the border to Mexico to that with Canada, California, the state that encompasses the majority of its distance, actually sees the smallest benefit. That's not to say the benefit is small. The removal of the interstate would correspond to a 6% loss in overall income in the state, but Oregon, the 12th most sparsely populated state in the nation, would lose 15% of its income if I-5 simply disappeared. It's worth fully considering just how staggering that statistic is. A single, simple 4-lane roadway stretching some 300 miles or 500 kilometers through Oregon, attributable for 15% of its income. This does, however, make sense. Oregon's economy, significantly undergirded by the natural resources, manufacturing, and agricultural sectors, is highly trade-dependent. The state does not, however, have any major export ports, so when a manufacturer in Salem, Oregon, for example, needs to transport the finished products to the port of Oakland, it would likely hire a truck to take the 9-hour journey south on I-5. The shortest non-interstate route, however, would take 13.5 hours on roads with potentially burdensome weight restrictions, inadequate facilities, low bridges, and other constraints. It just makes getting product out harder. Now, ultimately, transport cost is rarely an enormous portion of a given product's cost. A 5-cent increase on a $10 product produced further from Oakland isn't massive, but that's not the context that matters in the competition between places for industry. If the options are between a state that has a conduit enabling lower cost, reliable, fast transportation in and out, and all other factors are the same, why would a manufacturer decide to locate in the more poorly connected place? The economy is a competition, and in competition, the smallest margins matter even when they don't in a non-competitive context. Considering the alternative was the status quo, individual states building their own highways, disconnected from any national program, this program caught the states that couldn't afford massive infrastructure projects, many of which were in the South and West, up to the rest. Therefore, interstates made these states more competitive by reducing their relative distance to the rest of the world. That's not to say the program was perfect, though. Just as much as it proved
Definitely not perfect.
revolutionary to more rural areas, it gutted cities.
It really did gut cities. I mean, Robert Moses was one of the architects, and he ruined a lot of cities.
Neighborhoods, predominantly poorer ones, were leveled to the ground to make space for interstates and their associated infrastructure. This often created clear, physical barriers between certain neighborhoods and urban centers, which reduced opportunity in these excluded neighborhoods. They also had the effect of encouraging reduced density, which increases the environmental impact of cities, creates scenarios where job opportunity.
Yeah, cities are actually great for the environment. I mean, whereas when you build a suburb, you're like destroying the lots of the environment, you're polluting a larger area and such. But when you build in a city, you're concentrating all that pollution and such. and they're usually denser, so not as many cars. Although there's still a lot of cars, but yeah, it's just a denser environment, so you're not spreading as much pollution to neighboring areas. You're not chopping down as much trees or the environment. So cities are good in that way, but as we get less and less dense, you have to chop down more and more trees. You have to, mess up more and more of the environment. It's not a good thing. So yeah, I mean, you really should not put highways and such through cities either.
Is linked to car ownership and additional potential negative impacts. Altogether, the way in which interstates interact with cities was often poorly planned and executed. But when examined in aggregate, the interstate highway system is one of the best investments the United States ever made. While by no means unique to the United States in concept,
imagine how much better it would have been though if we had an interstate train system though instead of this. Like a really nice, high-speed rail and all these things instead. I mean, it's not like we need it just instead, because we could have an interstate highway system as well, but we should have focused more on the interstate train system.
the vastness and regional disparities in the country meant such a system had a uniquely powerful impact. For every dollar spent on the program, it has returned at least 6 in economic benefits. In the context of nations, connectivity is power. Therefore, the reason why the interstate highway system is the most impactful infrastructure program in American history is simply because, as of now, it's the largest.
Yeah, because as of now it is the largest. Imagine what we could have done though and what we can still do.
I definitely enjoy nerding out about the interstate. States, and hopefully you now do too, so I made a whole other video about the strangest, quirkiest sections of the system, like why Interstate 180 exists, just connecting to a town of 700 and traveled on by only about 100 vehicles per hour, or the town that essentially exists because one of the only streaming site founded by myself.
Okay. But yeah, it's a really interesting topic. I mean, it really does seem like it's so impactful and such because it's really the largest we've ever done. If we did something else just as large, it'd probably be even more impactful. I think only now are we really even looking back at infrastructure. Because infrastructure has a net positive for like the environment and just the economy and the country as a whole has a net positive. So if we actually focused on infrastructure like nowadays, or other parts of the country, like trains, public transportation and such, if we updated the infrastructure in these areas, we'd probably see even more of an economic benefit. Let's check out some of the comments though. For comparison, Pete Kostelnik ran across America on foot with the world record time of 42 days, 6 hours, 30 minutes from San Francisco City Hall to New York City Hall in 2016. Oh, damn. Oh. If only city skylines was around back then so that they could have built the interstates with proper lane mathematics. You can't put a price on a human life. U.S. Department of Transportation, $11.7 million. Why, the interstate part of the system was obviously important for the country. Putting it through the middle of cities was madness and has made U.S. cities the most unlivable in the OECD. True. Nearly all other countries have built no motorways around their cities. The U.S. is usually cited as a reason to keep them out of cities. I'd say that it's probably not a good idea to plow through neighborhoods and lay down miles of concrete, physically separating areas of the city. What's stopping development along a freeway that was built outside of the city? It happened with rivers, the canals, railroads, and highways. At that point, you still end up with the freeway through the city. Not really, not directly through the heart of the city, though, at least. But then it happens semi-organically. People know it's there and can plan accordingly. True. Yeah. It's a shame that we didn't take more from the Autobahn network. Not going through city centers, yeah. Allowing for no speed limits were practical, not political. Actually adhering to lane discipline, etc. True. Good point. The man whose idea it was to not have any stoplights on these highways is probably basking in glory in the heights of heaven. Highways don't have stoplights though, that's why they're called highways. They're above the arterial roads. Okay, that Eisenhower reveal was fantastic. What a legend. I knew it was Eisenhower though, but that's also a reason why I don't necessarily like Eisenhower that much. I've driven about 60% of the interstate highway system. So many epic stations from I-70 out in Colorado and Utah, to the Grapevine along I-5 in Southern California, the Virgin River Gorge. Interstates between cities, fantastic. Interstates around cities, great ring roads. Interstates through city centers and urban neighborhoods, always low income, dog shit. Yeah, you really should not put them through city centers and urban neighborhoods. It's a terrible, terrible idea. We've gutted our cities in the U.S. Like we've absolutely neglected them and just made them worse. Unfortunately, the biggest failure of the interstate highway system is the insistence that I wonder what I was gonna say there. Okay. A good portion of lumber in Oregon is shipped on trains. Oregon's got a lot of railroad route. Railroad is how it should be done. Shipping less than a carload by truck is way less efficient. Yep. Also, Oregon is largely a semiconductor economy. Lumber and other natural resources are overstated as its export. And Oregon has a port city, Portland. If there's one thing I really appreciate about these videos is the conversion from imperial to metric. Yeah, it is nice to have a conversion. A fun fact, the guy who decided on green for interstate signs was colorblind and thought he was selecting blue, but it turned out to be a good thing since green is more reflected than blue. Huh. I personally love the interstate highway system and the way it connects cities. However, I also feel that it has been a major roadblock for rail expansion in US, which is comparatively better for the environment compared to car or an airplane. I guess she was gonna say NYC to Boston. Yeah, NYC to Boston is good on like rails and such with the Acela Express and the Northeast Corridor and all that. Yeah. I can tell that you've never driven on I-95 in the state of Connecticut. The average speed on that section seems like only 25 miles per hour, so it has taken me like 7 hours to make the trip between NYC and Boston. Also, there's the Amtrak Acela and regional trains that take about 4 hours. 4 hours? Awesome. Oh yeah, I would way rather take the train. Part of the problem is that the US has prioritized freight rail over passenger rail, which again is good for distant rural regions with natural resources, but is bad for the development of passenger rail. Trains are great and work excellently for city-to-city transport, and I think we should definitely invest in them. But if you live in even a remotely rural area, then trains and other forms of public transport become infeasible. I don't fully agree with that. I think they can be feasible, even in these areas. A good bus system, it really helps out. Of course, you may need a car though if you live in a really rural area, but not suburbs. Yeah, suburbs are just a bad idea. The sheer amount of rail you would have to lay to connect the rural U.S. in a manner, yeah. There does need to be a balance, yeah. Dense communities can be connected via trains. Having a train serve at a remote location is not optimal. That's true. I'm really glad that you covered the negative impact that the interstate system had on cities. I would really love a video on the urban renewal that is coming about from the removal of freeways. One that I know of specifically is the one in Milwaukee. What I wish you covered was the negative impacts for small towns as well. Many towns just disappeared off the map, and Route 66 is pretty much gone now because of it. It has essentially led to the rise of consumer brands and household names instead of local industry. True. Unfortunately. We need to support local businesses, not all these big companies. I like that the highest ranking military officer in one of the greatest wars mankind has fought, and his conclusion was, man, infrastructure is really important. No, that's true. Not gonna lie though, highway system really separates the areas around Chicago. It feels like completely different stateless areas just going to a different neighborhood. You started a war between train lovers and car lovers. He kinda did, yeah. I am a I am a train lover, I should say. I'm a rail fan. The interstates are great, but I would still love a similarly large passenger rail network. Same. Preferably high speed where possible. In addition, trains are safer and less polluting than cars, and easier to travel on than planes. It's like a happy medium. Agreed. Let's see. Yeah, I really enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed my reaction, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. And yeah, I really thought it was interesting, but I feel like I did mention trains too many times, unfortunately. But I mean, I really do think trains are necessary. Bye bye.